Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're joining us. We're really pleased to have you here. My name is Andrew Buffard. As I mentioned, I'm an infrastructure consultant at CPCS. I've been with the company for over 15 years now. And we're really happy to have you today to our very first InfraSight webinar. So this is a new initiative of CPCS to share the thought leadership of our experts and our projects with the wider consulting and academic and private sector world. So we're really pleased to have you all here today. So CPCS, for those of you who don't know, so we're a management consulting company focused on infrastructure projects, designing, planning, implementing, and optimizing various projects in transportation and power sector. We also do quite a bit of work in public-private partnerships and data analytics. So just a few quick housekeeping items. So I'm Andrew, I'm your host. And just to let you know, we can receive comments from you at any time. We're really happy to have engagement from you. So if you look at the chat box on the right side of the screen, you can add any comments or reactions throughout the session. We'll have a Q&A time at the end of the session to take your questions. And so everyone is by default muted, so you won't be able to leave a voice comment, but if you just leave a chat comment, we can get to your input then. So if you miss anything during the presentation, if you've been late, don't worry. We will provide a recording to everyone who signed up by email after the session. So now to the interesting part, our speaker. So we have Dr. Samantha Witte today, who is a senior consultant and my good colleague at CPCS, based in our London office. Samantha is a regulatory economist. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Oxford, where she leveraged econometric and programming techniques to discover intervention opportunities for improving infrastructure services. At CPCS, Samantha is responsible for multiple financial and economic analyses. She's currently working on a power sector financial model for Ethiopia and an economic impact assessment for a private investment transaction in Ghana. We're also really grateful to have today our moderator for the Q&A, Manuel Tinoco, who is the head of our power advisory practice at CPCS. Manuel has over 40 years of experience in the analysis and planning of the development of global power systems across the world. So today, Samantha and Manuel, we're very fortunate, we'll be speaking about how regulatory interventions can help reverse underinvestment in critical electricity infrastructure. We'll be getting the benefit of Samantha's work during her PhD, and we're really happy that she'll be sharing her insights today to the group. So with that, over to you, Samantha. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrew, and nice to see everyone. Welcome to those joining us virtually today. I'll go ahead and share my screen before we start. So maybe, Andrew, you can give me a quick feedback on whether the screen's visible on screen.
All good.
Great. Well, thanks again. As Andrew said, my name is Samantha Witte. And today we'll be discussing what happens when distribution utilities hedge their bets. And specifically, we'll try to understand a bit better what governments, regulators, and investors can do to encourage distribution utilities to make critical investments in their infrastructure assets. So let's start with the why. Why are electric distribution utilities so important? And in my opinion, there are 4 key reasons why electric distribution utilities, or DISCOs, are critical for economic growth and for inclusive development. The first is that distribution utilities are integral to the financial and cash flow health of the entire power system. So if we think about a system where there are no wholesale power markets, which applies to a lot of developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, end users pay DISCOs for the electricity they've consumed, and the DISCOs are then responsible for passing those revenues on to the transmission company and onwards to generation units. And importantly, generation units also include independent power producers, so private capital holders. And so with that in mind, any difficulties that the DISCO is experiencing on the distribution side will trickle up through the sector all the way to the generation units. And because of that, DISCOs are actually foundational to introducing private capital into power sectors. And so one of the key due diligence questions that a government and investors will be asking themselves before introducing private capital into generation is, what is the DISCOs or the off-takers' ability to pay their dues? And are they able to service their liabilities towards the generation units? So that's reason number one. The second reason why DISCOs are so integral to economic growth is because they are one of the largest investors in electricity reliability. And so when you hear about load shedding, outages, and the lack of reliability, a big chunk of that goes back to insufficient generation capacity, absolutely. But a really significant factor relates to the investments that distribution utilities make in their distribution grid. And to see why that's important, a survey of manufacturers in India a number of years ago found that the average outage level in India led to an up to 10% loss in revenues for these manufacturers. And add on top of that, a 2% total factor productivity loss. So you can easily see why it's really important to understand how distribution utilities are doing and how we can encourage them to improve both in terms of their operational performance and their financial performance. The third reason here is that, unlike the case today, which we're discussing, which is Brazil, most utilities across the developing world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, have a significant public ownership share. So they're significantly held by the public, i.e. the government. And so there can be implicit and even explicit assumptions and arrangements that imply that when the distribution utility is experiencing cash flow problems or problems with rolling over debt or repaying debt, the government can and will step in to take on these liabilities. And this has large primary deficit impacts. As you can see here in a study by the IMF a number of years ago, they estimate that the contribution of distribution utilities to the primary deficit, depending on which country you ask, ranges between 0.5% of gross domestic product and 27% of gross domestic product. And so when governments are engaged in these ad hoc or continuous bailouts of distribution utilities, this has real implications for their credit ratings and their ability to roll over their debt. And we saw this actually earlier this year in the case of South Africa and Eskom. And then finally, the fourth reason why DISCOs are so important to understand is distributed generation. Distributed generation includes when renewable energy assets are plugged directly into the distribution grid to serve the local demand centers, rather than into transmission on a utility scale farm, for example. And so what that means is that a lot of the distributed generation assets really depend on the distribution grid itself and not transmission. To see why this is important, let's take the case of the United States. In the US in 2022, half of the solar PV capacity additions came through distributed generation assets and not through transmission connected utility scale assets. And then similarly in the EU, it's estimated that by 2030, we'll require over 400 billion euros in investments in the distribution grid to accommodate renewable energy assets. So again, this is particularly relevant for any OECD and industrialized countries interested in the clean transition and accommodating a large share of renewables within the grid in a quick amount of time. And so now that we know why DISCOs are important, let's talk about how they're challenged. There are three key areas that have been pretty well studied in terms of how distribution utilities are struggling from a commercial performance side of things. The first area is under collection in the form of high receivables and write-offs. This is when DISCOs are struggling to collect revenues that they've billed their end users for. And this can result in high receivables, and in the worst case scenario, when DISCOs give up on collecting these revenues, this results in bad debt and write-offs for the utility. The second deficiency area is electricity theft. So this is a situation where end users are directly tapping into the distribution grid and effectively stealing electricity. And this represents foregone revenues for the utility, of course. And then finally, the third major area that we can group the deficiencies into is underpricing of tariffs. And what this means is when the electricity tariff that the regulator allows the utility to charge its end users lies below the operating expenses and capital expenses that the utility is actually expending. And all of these three things together represent performance shortfalls that create unfavorable working capital demands on the utility. They decrease profits, and they also reduce operating cash flows. And all of these things together can and will limit a DISCO's ability to invest in its distribution grid. The good news is that solutions exist, and there are a number of success stories where utilities have been turned around. One salient example is again in the case of Brazil, which we'll look into in detail today. In 2011, 6 of the worst utilities were rejected by private sector buyers because they were so deficient along the lines of what we just discussed. International finance institutions stepped in and instituted a number of changes that resulted in these same DISCOs, the 6 worst DISCOs a couple of years ago, becoming viable options for private sector purchase. And they were successfully privatized in the end. And so the existing solutions usually tackle 3 major areas. The first is investing in smart grid network equipment and metering. This allows utilities to track outages in real time and respond to them quickly, but it also allows them to charge consumers based on the amount of electricity they've actually consumed. The second solution area is usually registering unbilled customers and combining that with communication campaigns to tackle a low willingness to pay, which we know exists in a lot of lower income countries. And finally, solutions result in, or at least tackle, reducing or ideally removing subsidies that the government is paying that allow DISCOs to maintain low quality connections to customers that are not paying for their electricity. Customers are happy to tolerate the low quality because they're not paying. And in return, the utility is happy to maintain a low quality because they are being paid by the government to do so, and there are no expectations for improving. And this is what's called the subsidy trap. And it's actually very salient in the case of Colombia, where researchers really highlighted this problem. Now, today we'll focus on a slightly different area. We're going to look at and evaluate an overlooked intervention opportunity, which involves reducing the uncertainty, i.e. the volatility of cost recovery. So instead of looking at the level of cost recovery through tariffs for utilities, we want to understand how uncertainty and the variations in the level of cost recovery affects a utility's ability to invest. And this will allow us to draw a deeper understanding of how to improve critical distribution assets. Focusing on uncertainty is really important here, I think, because it will allow us, as you'll see later, to explain why deficient infrastructure quality might actually coexist with high electricity prices in a number of developing countries. And secondly, there has been a trend towards multi-year tariff orders, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And the obvious question is, what specifics of the tariff formula should we focus on in order to achieve and encourage sufficient investments? And so the devil really lies in the details, and this is what we're concerned with today. So, let's talk about the specific research question. The question we want to ask ourselves today is, how did an intervention that improved the predictability of cost recovery impact investment behaviors by distribution utilities? And we're going to focus on Brazil and ask ourselves, what was the US dollar value of additional lumpy investments that were directly encouraged by an intervention that reduced the volatility of cost recovery in Brazil? Now, before we go into the roadmap for today, it's really important that we understand what lumpy investments are. Lumpy investments are large in terms of their monetary value. They are sunk cost in the sense that the utility cannot expend half of the capital expenditure for half of the entire benefit. So the capital expenditure project has to be completed for the distribution grid to benefit from it. And finally, these investments are irreversible. And this is going to be very important from an economic theory perspective, meaning that the utility can't easily recover the costs by, for example, selling off the spare parts and undoing the structure. Here are 2 examples in pictures that I've included to really illustrate in sort of tangible terms what this means. On the left-hand side, we have a substation. This is one really important example of lumpy investments, and substations allow power systems to change the voltage levels from high voltage to low voltage or medium voltage. And then on the right-hand side, we have another type of infrastructure, which are transformers, and they allow for a similar mechanism just throughout the distribution grid. So with that in mind, let's go through the roadmap for today. We'll start with dissecting the tariff formula in Brazil and identify hidden cash flow risks affecting distribution utilities. We'll then interpret the regulatory intervention that occurred in 2015 and use economic theory to form a hypothesis for how this would have affected investments by distribution utilities. And then we'll move on to the fun part, which is actually estimating and quantifying the damage done by uncertainty, and on the flip side, the potential benefits from the anti-uncertainty intervention. So we'll be able to identify and quantify the binding constraints to lumpy investments in electricity quality. And there are two things required for this. The first is we really want to lay the foundation for causality. As practitioners, many of you will be interested in the policy implications from the research that we're presenting today. And establishing causality is critical for this, because we're not interested in correlative results, but in cause and effect. And then we'll be able to actually look at the empirical results. We'll then go one step further and ask ourselves, are there alternative explanations for the impact we're seeing in the data? And can we rule those alternative counterfactual explanations out so we really know that we're capturing the impact of uncertainty on investments? And there are two things I'd like to take you through for that. The first is a structural break test, and the second is a matching on observables algorithm that uses a little bit of machine learning to test for this hypothesis. And then finally, we'll draw some key implications for the best practice of intervention design in developing countries and beyond. So let's start with dissecting the tariff formula in Brazil. This is a stylized representation of how distribution utilities are allowed to be compensated for the electricity that consumers consume. So the price in Brazilian reais per kilowatt hour in this period is a function of two things: the price the last time it was adjusted, and any changes in marginal costs between the last period and today. But there are three key details that we really want to understand because they become relevant later on. The first is the duration of the intervals between adjustments. And what you want to know here is that the tariff is adjusted annually for marginal costs. However, any cost changes within that year are not allowed to be passed on to end users. The second key characteristic is what's included in the tariff formula. And particularly or specifically what's included is two components: a manageable component consisting of operating expenses that the utility is undergoing. So these are things within the control of the utility, and an unmanageable component, mainly power purchases from generators. And the critical part here is that what's excluded from the tariff between the two reviews is any marginal cost spikes between the reviews. So this is where utilities can be exposed. So why did this create a problem specifically in 2013 in Brazil? To answer this question, what we want to know is that in Brazil, the system is highly dependent on hydropower. And specifically in 2015, 70% of electricity generation stemmed from hydropower. And so on the map on the left-hand side, you'll see in the orange shaded area that Brazil experienced the worst drought in 40 years, starting in 2013. The drought particularly affected the southeastern region. And unfortunately, this is also where the Itaipu Dam is located, which is one of the largest dams in Brazil. And what this did, as you can see on the right-hand side, is that the water storage levels dipped significantly below the 10-year average starting in 2013. And in fact, if you were to extrapolate this chart further to the right, water levels stayed low through 2014 and 2015. Generators responded to this by purchasing any shortfalls from a supply perspective on the spot market. And the issue with this was that the additional electricity stemmed from thermal generators, so thermal power plants. Think diesel, for example. These power plants were very expensive to run due to Brazil-specific reasons and characteristics related to the plants themselves. And so the reason and how this affected utilities is that it increased their marginal costs starting in 2013. Let's illustrate that a bit further. So on the left-hand side, as you can see, is a timeline of the events. In 2013, the drought sets on. In 2014, the Typhoon Dam increases its tariff and marginal costs start to increase for utilities. And then briefly touching upon this, in 2015, the government intervenes with a regulatory mechanism, which we'll go into in the subsequent slides. But for now, I'd like you to focus on the chart on the right-hand side, which is a histogram of the changes in the marginal costs for each distribution utility in Brazil from 2013 to 2014. And what you can see here, and then the key takeaway is that marginal costs on average for the average utility increased by 40% between those 2 years. This held really practical implications for the financial viability of these companies and their ability to stay in business. And the way to think through this is that the utilities experienced a 40% increase in marginal costs on average, which immediately flows through to their net income and then operating cash flows. And this is because they pay generators in real time. At the same time, they're not able to adjust their tariffs to reflect this cost increase and pass it on to end users. And what this means and what it really implied was that the credit rating agency started to issue credit warnings for the companies and downgrade some of them even. That made it more difficult for the distribution utilities to roll over their debt and borrow at reasonable borrowing conditions. In the worst case scenario, a situation like this can lead to an dilutive equity raise, which is when the utility has to raise additional equity, which impoverishes existing shareholders. And so all of this to say that what's transpired in 2013 onwards in Brazil was an emergency situation for a lot of utilities. It's not a surprise then that in 2015, the government stepped in. And specifically, the government in Brazil stepped in with a tariff flag mechanism, as it was called. And so let's dissect this a bit further, because if you remember from earlier, we really care about uncertainty as a driver of investments today. And so what aspects of the intervention changed uncertainty for utilities is the key question. The table helps us answer this. I'd like to focus on the 3 rows at the bottom here, which tell us what happened for the treated companies, i.e. the utilities that were eligible for the tariff flag mechanism, and the non-treated companies, which were those that didn't get to enjoy it. The first thing to point out is the cost risks between reviews now rested on consumers for the treated companies, while it continues to rest on the distribution companies for those that are not eligible. The ability to change prices between the annual reviews now exists for treated firms. Specifically, they were able to pass prices on, or rather costs, on a month-to-month basis to end users, whereas the utilities that didn't receive this tariff flag mechanism were not allowed to do that. And finally, the key takeaway here is that the price is now adjusted monthly, just to reiterate, for the treated firms, and annually for the non-treated companies. These 3 features together I interpret as a reduction in uncertainty of cost recovery for the eligible distribution utilities. And just to show you a bit more how this played out geographically, the map on the left-hand side depicts Brazil and its transmission network. And on the top left-hand corner, you can see the 2 key states that were excluded from the policy, Amazonas and Roraima. And so the utilities in these 2 states were exempt from the tariff flag mechanism. And that gives us our variation between the both groups. And this will be really important from an estimation perspective later on. So what does economic theory have to say about all of this? One framework for thinking through how utilities make investment decisions is that they look at the internal rate of return of an investment project and compare it to the hurdle rate, which is a combination of a risk-free rate and a risk premium to reflect the fact that the investment is riskier than, say, a government bond investment. And the utility would move forward with a large substation investment or a significant grid expansion, as long as the internal rate of return exceeds the hurdle rate. Now, when uncertainty increases, this increases the discount rate for both types of investments, lumpy and non-lumpy, meaning the reversible, smaller ongoing expenditures. However, this is where real options theory comes in. Real options theory applies when investments are lumpy. And what it predicts is that when uncertainty increases, not only does the discount rate go up to reflect higher risks associated with the project, but there's also a greater option value for utilities of awaiting further information on the business environment, both the return on the investment and any regulatory interventions that may happen to mitigate what's going on. And what this means is that there is a value of waiting and seeing. That's because the investment can't easily be undone. This results in a higher profitability threshold that investments have to reach and exceed to be eligible. And all else held equal, this should lower investment rates. But what this means is that investment rates should decline by a larger rate than for lumpy investments than for ongoing operating expenditures. And this distinction between both types of expenditures allows us to estimate the impact specifically for companies engaged in the sunk cost business. These are utilities and electricity, but can also apply to utilities and telecoms and transportation companies, any companies engaged in sunk cost businesses. So now that we know what the hypothesis is for today, let's talk in a nutshell about the estimation method. How do we go about this empirically? And without going into the details, there are a few things that I'd like you to take away from this. The question we want to ask, just as a reminder, is what was the US dollar value of additional lumpy disco investments that were directly enabled by the tariff formula intervention? And there is a neat method for going about this in certain situations, which is a difference in difference estimation. And all this does in a nutshell is to combine two types of comparisons. A comparison of the situation before 2015 and after 2015, as well as a comparison between the treatment group, which is the utilities that received the tariff-like mechanism, and the control group, which are the utilities that were not eligible. So let's focus on the chart on the right-hand side to illustrate this a bit. On the x-axis, we have time, and on the y-axis, the outcome variable. What's the outcome variable in our case? The US dollar value of additional lumpy investments. And so the central assumption in a difference in difference estimation strategy is that before 2015, both utility groups in Brazil would have been on similar trajectories in terms of their investment behavior, as you can see in the two diagonal lines. Then the intervention happens in 2015, and suddenly there is a divergence between both utility groups. So the gap in investment behavior goes from A to B. And the difference in those two gaps represents the impact effect, which is C here. So this is what we're going to estimate. So to sort of drive home the idea, the difference in difference estimation assumes that electricity companies that were offered the tariff reform policy should exhibit higher investments in their distribution grids compared to the pre-policy time period and compared to companies that were excluded. But this is where we get to our job as economic impact assessment undertakers. We want to try and establish causality as much as we can. There are two things we can do here that are really our job. The first is to prove parallel trends, which are those two parallel lines that you saw in the prior chart. And the second thing we want to do is to control for confounders. And we'll see this a bit more in the next slide. But again, in short, confounders really represent alternative explanations that could be influencing our impact, that we're not as interested in as uncertainty. So without going into any of the details on the specific estimation strategy, there are three things that I'd like you to take away from this particular slide. The first is, in this estimation equation, on the left-hand side, we have our outcome variable. And this is the number of lumpy investments undertaken by distribution utilities. And if you recall, we linked this directly to the quality of supply and economic growth, as well as inclusive development. So that's what we really care about today. Then the second aspect is on the right-hand side. This is an interaction variable, and all it does is combine two things, the two comparisons we talked about earlier. The first is a dummy variable that tells us, are we before or after 2015? In which period are we? And the second is a dummy variable that tells us whether we are amongst the treated group of utilities or the utilities that did not receive the tariff lag mechanism. And this interaction variable gives us beta, which is going to be our estimated coefficient, or the impact multiplier, we can call it as well. So that's what we'll focus on in the empirical results later on. And then the final thing that I'd like you to take away from this is that it's really important to control for alternative explanations here. Let's take rainfall for an example. An increase in rainfall in the areas that the eligible utilities operate in could very well cause a regulator to say, I imagine that marginal costs will be volatile in the future, and I'm going to institute an anti-uncertainty measure in the future to sort of foresee that volatility. So rainfall could directly influence the tariff lag mechanism and where it's actually implemented. At the same time, rainfall could directly impact lumpy investments. For example, more storms will lead to a larger depreciation rate for capital expenditures and PPE assets in general, and that can lead utilities to increase their lumpy investments. The problem with that is we wouldn't be measuring the impact of uncertainty on lumpy investments, or the impact of rainfall on both the policy occurring and on lumpy investments. So we want to rule that out by controlling for things like rainfall, economic activity, and importantly, the level of cost recovery, which I've depicted here. So with the estimation strategy in mind and knowing what we're trying to control for, here are the results. And for this, I'd like you to focus on the third column. The third column includes all of the controls we discussed. And if you focus on the first row here, what it implies is that the tariff reform policy caused a 13% increase in the number of lumpy investments undertaken by the treated firms. And the other thing you can see is that this is a significant effect from a statistical perspective. So it's significant at what we call a 90% confidence interval. As practitioners, again, I think it's really important to put these numbers into economic context. And we can do that. So with an average annual number of 3.7 lumpy investments per year, the 13% increase implies an increase of the lumpy investments from 3.7 on average a year to 4.2. And that amounts to $1.7 to $2.1 million in investments per utility. And these are additional investments in the distribution grid that directly flow into the quality of electricity supply. As you remember earlier, we talked about real options theory, and we used it to form a hypothesis for how uncertainty would affect lumpy investments more than ongoing investments. We can test this explicitly in the data to increase our confidence. And here are the results of that. So again, real options theory predicts that uncertainty should affect lumpy investments more than ongoing investments because of the option value of weighting future information. And as you can see here, again, focusing on the third column, the marginal investments did not increase significantly in response to the tariff reform policy. And what that implies is that uncertainty indeed affects lumpy decisions more than reversible investments through both a higher discount rate and a higher option value. Now, we've established the key empirical results. Before we interpret them and go into the key implications for best practice intervention design, let's talk about the robustness of these results for a moment. We want to build confidence that these are causal results and not correlated results. And there are two key questions we can ask here to do that. The first is, were both groups of utilities in Brazil on parallel trends before the policy intervention? And the way we can look at this is through what's called a structural break test in econometrics. And what we can say is, well, let's assume that the event didn't happen in 2015, and let's shift it to other hypothetical years. Do we get a significant impact multiplier or coefficient? And if we do, that's bad news because we only expect a coefficient to be large and significant in 2015. But what you can see from the chart on the left is that indeed the F statistic, which captures this impact multiplier, doesn't increase or it isn't significant up until the year in which the intervention took place. So that's good news because it tells us our results are unlikely to be driven by a divergence in investment behavior that started before 2015. The second question that we want to ask ourselves is, was the tariff reform policy assigned randomly? And this is really important in the case of the context in which we at CPCS and a lot of you operate, which is where political economy cycles can drive regulatory decisions, particularly around elections. And favoritism can also come into play. And so what if the utilities that received the treatment, that received the tariff mechanism, received it as part of a broader package in which they were generally favored? Those other package contents could increase investments by these utilities without uncertainty actually having an impact. And so it's really important that we can sort of investigate whether this effect is at play. And the way we do this is with a machine learning algorithm. And here I certainly am happy to go into details in the Q&A, but for now, what I want you to take away is how it works on a high level, which is we assume that the treated utilities are special. And we then find amongst the non-eligible utilities, those that seem the most similar to the treated utilities based on a number of observable factors. And then we rerun the estimation from the previous slides on this subset. So the original treated utilities and then the subset of non-treated utilities that are very similar. If the impact, the 13% increase, weakens in any way, that spells bad news because it implies that the more similar you become to a treated utility, the less likely you are to differ from them in terms of the investment impact. And what I can say is that the 13% increase, once we do this, does not change significantly after the rerun estimation. And so that's great because both of these two things together give us confidence that our results are, number one, causal, and secondly, not driven and very unlikely to be driven by alternative explanations. So here is a summary of the empirical results before we move into the implications. The first result is that the tariff reform caused a 13% increase in the number of lumpy investments in Brazil, amounting to $2 million in additional investments per utility. The second result is that marginal investments did not significantly respond to the tariff reform policy. And finally, whether political economy motivations and distribution losses, as well as the level of cost recovery, can be ruled out as alternative explanations. There are four key implications that I think these empirical results hold for the work that we do here at CPCS and some of the work that you will be undertaking. The first is that uncertainty can reduce critical investments by businesses involved in sunk cost services, even if on average tariffs recover costs, which means that we want to pay specialized attention towards the details of the formula, the tariff formula in this case. This includes the frequency of the adjustment, but also what specifically is included in the pass-through and what isn't. The second implication is that uncertainty affects the investment hurdle rate more when investments are irreversible, which means that some cost service providers are in a way special and they require distinct frameworks, whether it's a cost-benefit analysis we're conducting or an economic impact assessment. They need to be understood in a specialized way that takes into account the additional effect of uncertainty on their investments. Thirdly, as we know, a lot of countries are incorporating a significant share of renewables into their generation mix. In the case of Brazil, however, and a lot of countries that are heavily reliant on hydropower, this can cause unintended damages for the quality of electricity supply for the reasons that we've outlined today. And so what this means is that an assessment is really needed of the adverse impacts of renewable energy capacity additions. And then finally, what we've shown today is that it is possible to quantify the causal damages from interventions or even the benefits that interventions represent. in this case on an ex post basis, but certainly also on an ex ante basis. And this is important when countries face multiple competing problems and they want to prioritize between them and rank the different problem magnitudes. So the way to think about quantifying the problem magnitude, whether it's through econometrics or anything else, is taking the changes in the target variable, which is outages, for example, times the impact multiplier, in our case, the 13% increase in lumpy investments. So before I end and pass on to Manuel Tinoco, our head of power, for his additional remarks, here is a snapshot of the 10 representative projects that we've undertaken here at CPCS. And these are solutions that we've delivered through our power, public-private partnership, and Africa practice experts on 3 different levels: market reform, contract design, and regulatory design, which is what we focused on today. And with that, I'll end here and pass on to Manuel. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha, for this very interesting presentation. Your research outcomes are very clear. There is a strong case for reducing uncertainty in the profits of utilities, okay? This will obviously translate into keeping up with investment plans and improving operation and maintenance. I would like to make a few remarks about the state of the utilities in Africa and see how the outcomes of this research of yours could be applied in this region, which is the main focus of most interventions recently carried out by CPCS. My comment applies to distribution companies, which are the ones mostly affected by poor profitability and performance in the region. I mentioned this recent report by the World Bank that compiled data from 76 utilities in 45 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Although there are positive achievements in the electricity access rate that increased from 28% in 2000 to 48% in 2018, and generation capacity that grew from 63 gigawatts in 2000 to 106 gigawatts in 2017, there are still plenty of problems. For example, to name a few, profitability. The report found that less than half of all utilities are profitable. This is really worrisome. About a third of those utilities incur net losses of more than 20%. The other factor is the losses. Distribution losses ranged from 8.5% to 51%, with a median of 17% compared to a reference benchmark value of 12%. Delay of investments and poor maintenance. Utilities, when short of cash, we know that often delayed investments and maintenance, which impacts the quality of service. Low reliability. The reported median values of SAIDI, which is means the average duration of interruptions, and SAIFI, the average frequency of interruptions, were 52 hours for SAIDI and 25 interruptions for SAIFI, which are quite high compared to international standards. For example, in Europe, the SAIDI ranges from 9 to 370 minutes, which means 0.15 to 6.1 hours. That is, the median reported SAIDI in sub-Saharan Africa is almost 9 times higher than the worst country in Europe. Electrification rates in sub-Saharan Africa hovers today around 50%, being much worse in rural areas. So hundreds of millions of people don't have access to electricity. Also compounding to these problems is the high prices dominated in most cases by energy prices reflecting dependency on fossil fuels, the HFO and diesel, to name a few. We saw that the impact of that in the recent crisis caused by the war in Ukraine. On the positive side, we have seen an evolution in the right direction in terms of price regulations. Many countries are moving away from the traditional cost of service regulation, also known as cost plus, with an ideally annual price review, to more advanced incentive regulation schemes such as the price cap or revenue cap modalities, incorporating performance incentives through multi-year tariff schemes. In these schemes, multi-year tariff, the formulas are reset every 4 to 5 years, and tariff reviews can happen when certain indicators deviate significantly from the initial projected values. We have also seen hybrid price regimes where certain parts of the utilities revenue requirements can be quickly adjusted due to the uncontrollable factors. However, we need to be mindful that more frequent reviews of the tariff formulas can present certain challenges in the region. Policy issues, for example, stability of prices, changes required in the regulatory framework, the capacity or ability of the regulatory agency to drive these changes. We know in some countries the regulator is not strong enough, it's not capable enough to go into a sophisticated tariff review mechanisms. The ability of utilities to collect and process information that involves metering systems and processes, and the impact ultimately on consumers, which is the ability to pay for the energy, for the electricity. There could be a need for compensation mechanisms for vulnerable consumers, and also subsidies. So with these closing comments in mind, we would now like to hear your thoughts, comments, and questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Samantha and Manuel. The very engaging presentation and closing comments. We do have a handful of comments in the chat, as well as a couple that have come through some other channels. So maybe just to be comprehensive, we can run through each of them. Samantha, I don't know if it makes sense to pull up your presentation again, because I did take some notes of when some of these comments came through, and the first one from Stefan was I believe on slide 11, and perhaps that would help provide a bit more context to this comment. But the comment/question is, the opposite problem is also more and more common. Some generation can be stuck in very low prices, or when nodal, even zonal pricing is used. This is the case in Chile now, where transmission cannot build fast enough. Not sure if you or Emmanuel have a reaction or response to that.
Manuel, happy for you to, if you want to start with an answer. I also know there are two questions on the economics, which I'll be happy to answer as well. And I've pulled up slide 11 here, if this is the right one.
I think the question from Stefan relates to the problem we're facing in many countries now, that with the tremendous amount of new installations, of especially solar PVs, there's a lack of transmission capacity. Okay, the projects are coming, but the transmission is lagging behind. So there is a trend now towards maybe including the private sector in the expansion of the networks. So I think this is also a related problem that we are seeing everywhere now.
Thanks, Manuel. And a few questions from Austin here. Maybe this one is for you, Samantha. Just a question on the treatment, how treatment is assigned / eligibility is determined.
Yes.
Would you like to respond to this?
No, very happy to. And thanks so much for the question. I'm happy to take both of your questions, Austin. And the first one's very important, because I think what you're alluding to here is randomness. It's really important that, at least from this empirical perspective, that the treated utilities were not somehow, this was not a non-random assignment of the treatment. And to understand that better, one of the approaches you can take is a narrative identification and a narrative analysis of why the intervention occurred, in the words of the government itself. And so in the case of Brazil in this map, the reason that they gave was that it was a technical reason. The two states of the Northeast were at the time, they are now, but at the time were not connected to the transmission network. And so this was the reason cited for why they were not eligible for the tariff-like mechanism. And that reason implies that it's a fixed reason, so it's a fixed variable, which already reduces the chances of confounding, and that it's a predetermined variable, which is also very helpful. So that's in terms of eligibility of assignment. The second question is on, is it possible that the drought had other impacts on the utilities that didn't come through uncertainty. And it's a similar kind of issue that we face when we're utilizing instrumental variables, right? So we want the only impact to come through the variable that we're using as a proxy. And in this case, it's uncertainty we care about. And it's very important. And what I've tried to do to capture any indirect impacts that the drought would have had on utilities, for example, through economic development or rather economic activity and through geography, is through these control variables. So I include rainfall in the estimation, a measure of lightning to really get closer to a sense of storm damage, and economic activity on a municipality level. And so the idea here is to ensure that we're capturing as many of these observable variables as possible that could confound the results so that we can really isolate uncertainty. And then just one more thing to add, the matching on observables algorithm takes that one step further, and it says, well, maybe there are things we can't include because they're not observable, so we as econometricians can't include them in the data set. They don't exist. And that's what it tries to take care of, is any sort of political economy considerations. Now, is it 100% certain that the estimates are causal? As you know, in economics, not possible to say, but there is a plausibility here of, a very high percentage that these are causal results. And that's how I try to ensure that and maximize that we're looking at causal rather than correlative results. Hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Samantha. We do have another question also from Austin on the Brazil case study and looking at the drought as well. So the question is, apart from the tariff design intervention, did anything else change with regards to sector policy in response to the drought? You mentioned that rainfall was included as a control. Did you include any lagged rainfall controls to potentially account for delayed impacts of or responses to the drought?
Another great question. And I think on the details of this, I'm very happy to engage with you offline as well and tell you a bit more about the estimation results. I did not include the lagged results of rainfall, but certainly would want to double check for being definite on that. And in terms of other sectoral changes, the key change was the tariff lag mechanism. The other change that occurred was that an emergency fund that was propping up a number of utilities, and this was a broader emergency fund, ended. It ended in 2013, just as the drought was starting. But that was more coincidence than anything else. So it ended before all of these effects started playing out. But again, very happy to engage on the details with you offline, Austin.
Yeah, it's great. I think this is what happens when you have two economists asking tough questions. It's great. We did have another question, Samantha and Manuel, that came through a separate channel. And maybe this is for both of you and very interesting for some of our colleagues here on how we can apply this to other countries. The question is, what are possible reasons why Brazil might have been able to implement this reform? And how can we apply this to other countries? So interesting one, perhaps, for either of you to share some thoughts on.
Definitely, and I'm happy to start with some micro thoughts on Brazil and pass on to you, Manuel, on the broader political economy difficulties. The one thing that stands out to me in the case of Brazil, and I think this is sort of ongoing research for me as well, is that the introduction of this monthly adjustment was combined with a communication campaign. So it wasn't just imposed on consumers out of the blue without any additional policies, but it was a tariff flag. So on a month ahead basis, consumers would get a traffic light mechanism. Green, meaning no price increases ahead. Orange, meaning there will be slight price increases. Red implying there will be significant price increases. So in a way, consumers had a month or so to plan ahead for the next price increase, and maybe that helped with being able to mitigate or hedge in any way. That's the one thing that stands out to me, but certainly I think there's more to it that is really worth investigating, because that will carry through to other countries. But from me, again, the key takeaway is communication campaigns for Brazil.
Yeah, I could add to that, Samantha, that well, the case in Brazil, for example, is that the price of electricity is basically passed to consumers. And this price, as the system is heavily dominated by hydro, it's volatile, right? We know that. So if you don't have a long-term contract, then you're exposed to this volatility. This might not be the case in every country. So each country has its own characteristics. And obviously in Brazil, the market is open, really. Any consumer can really select or choose their supplier and enter into long-term contracts if desired. The lesson maybe for Africa in general, Sub-Saharan Africa, is that any mechanism that promotes the certainty of the revenues and profits of the utility is a good thing to do. For example, we've seen in many countries they are moving from traditional cost of service regulation to multi-year tariff regimes, where the formulas are set 4 or 5 years in advance based on 2 or 3 variables, being, for example, the consumer price index and the exchange rate. And then based on these 2 parameters, the initial tariff gets adjusted every year. And there could be also revisions of those tariff formulas if some event happens that requires that revision. So I think that in general, the move from a cost of service, which is kind of a backward-looking way of doing things, to a forward-looking mechanism, which is the multi-year tariff, is positive in any country. And we'll be working with many countries in trying to implement these mechanisms. Of course, there is a lot of training to be done. The utilities need to be, and the utilities and the regulator needs to be up to date in all these new techniques, and the information has to be reliable. But I see that this experience in Brazil could be translated into Africa in this regard. I mean, trying to make the revenues of the utilities more predictable.
Thank you, Manuel and Samantha. I think that's a great place to perhaps close our session. We're just at time. So just a final thank you to Samantha for the excellent presentation, and Manuel for your engagement as well, and to all of our participants. We're really grateful for your time. As I mentioned earlier, we will be following up with the recording and some key takeaways for your reference. And we look forward to engaging you in the coming months and years on future InfraSight sessions at CPCS. So thanks again, Samantha, Manuel, and everyone who joined today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.